if you ever watch the show and you hear restaurants or things like that, it's actually all totally accurate. And I ended up going to a Holy Cross school, not a Jesuit school, but I went to a Holy Cross college called King's College in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. And then after that, thought about what I would do with my career. And I ended up going to work in Buffalo, New York for 2 summers doing research. And for me, that was transformational. My high school yearbook said that I wanted to be an orthodontist. That's what I thought I was going to be. And then I did this summer away doing research, and I was like, wow, I can actually take care of patients and run a research lab at the same time. And it was that one summer away that really crystallized my desire to go to medical school. So then I went to medical school. I got into MD, PhD programs. We're going to talk about that in a minute. And then after that, I ended up doing a residency in internal medicine and then a fellowship in rheumatology. So I take care of people who have joint problems. And then I moved back to Stanford. So I was at Harvard for 8 years, and then back here at Stanford now for 18 years. How many of you are thinking about careers in life science or STEM? Science, technology, engineering, math. Okay. How about medicine? How many of you are thinking about going to med school? Okay. How about doing engineering or research related stuff? Okay. Any people thought about combining the two of them? A little bit? Okay. All right, so I run a big high school research program called SIMR, Stanford Institute of Medical Research, and we've had a number of bells. There were 3 bells who participated this past year. I'm trying to remember the names of them. Quentin.
Oh, Quentin, sure.
Quentin was one. His brother was actually in my research lab.
Delphine, is it?
Yeah, Delphine, right?
Yeah, Delphine.
Guillaume was his brother who ended up going to Princeton.
Oh, cool.
And there were 2 others. I can't remember the names of the other 2.
I think Arvin too.
Oh, Arvin was one. Yep. Yeah, I remember Arvin very well. And there was a 3rd one. I can't remember.
No, I think it was an A.
Yeah, I can't remember.
Probably.
There's definitely 3 though. So I run that program, and I also run Stanford's MD PhD program, which has 94 students in it. So I'm pretty involved with education, and if you're thinking about medicine or research as your careers move forward, you should always think about coming back and asking me questions. I have an open door policy, and you all have my email address. Okay, so one of the first things you should be thinking of, there's only 8 slides, so this is meant to be really an introduction to all of you of the field. So, I like to tell students you should do what you're passionate about doing, find your passion and figure out a way to make it pay. That's what my parents told me. And my parents didn't go to college. My dad didn't graduate high school. He actually left and fought in World War II and then came back and got thrown out of Catholic school. So that's a whole other story about why he got thrown out of Catholic school. So I didn't grow up in a family where everyone was college educated, but my parents said, you have to go to college and you have to figure out what you're passionate about doing. And so I was fortunate because I found my passion relatively early. It's the junior year of college that I found it. If you're interested in science, though, one of the other things you have to think about is, even at this stage, is, am I going to be able to get a job down the road? So if you said you wanted to be a philosophy, get a PhD in philosophy and teach at or do research or teach at a university, those sorts of jobs might be a little bit harder to get. In science, there was a report that came out, and this is an overview of that report from U.S. News and World Report, that showed that there are actually 5 million unfilled jobs right now for people who have a STEM degree. So if you go into science, technology, engineering, or math, you're almost certain to be able to have a job when you graduate from college. It could be anything from research to teaching to government to policy. So you're thinking about things the right way if you're interested in STEM. Now, I also want to just give you a quick idea of some basic things about your age and where you're going to be at and how long it takes for training and how much debt you would accrue for various things. If you decide you're going to go to medical school, this is what the path looks like. So typically, you graduate from college or high school at the age of about 18. You finish college at around the age of 21 or 22. You then do medical school. Most medical schools in the United States are 4 years, but there are some that are 3 years, and Stanford has a 4 or 5 year option, which allows you to do a lot of research while you're in med school. So now you're about 26, and at the age of 26, you get your MD, graduate, everyone starts calling you doctor, but you can't practice medicine yet. You still have to do a residency. The average debt right now in the United States is over $300,000 when you go to med school. That's how much debt you graduate with. However, it's still an awesome field. You can make the money back relatively easily, and if you decide to combine it with a PhD, the whole thing is paid for. All of medical school, all of your PhD. So you graduate with your MD and your PhD degree completely free of any debt, other than college debt. After med school's over, then you have to do a residency. So it's a 1-year internship, and then typically if you do something like internal medicine or family medicine, pediatrics, it's 2 more years. So it's 3 years total. So now you're roughly around the age of 29, and you can start making some reasonably good money around the age of 28. You can moonlight. And I would say most residents, when they're training, are making about $65,000 a year. Very little expenses because you're in the hospital all the time, and you're eating all your meals there, so they pay for that. And then if you decide to do specialty training, that's additional time. So if you want to be a cardiologist or a rheumatologist or an endocrinologist, that's another anywhere from 1 to 3 more years. So you're really not done with all your training until you're about 32. If you do a surgical residency, those are typically 4 or 5 years. So again, you're roughly around the age of 32. Most of the starting salaries, if you're going into things like pediatrics, family medicine, those basic sorts of things, are probably about $180,000 a year. So you can make really good money, and depending on where you go, you can make even more money. And there's ways to get your whole education paid for. For example, if you join the armed forces, or if you agree to work in an urban setting, so you work in an inner city, or you work in an Indian reservation where there's Native Americans, you commit to doing that for a period of time, they'll pay for everything. So they'll pay all of your old debt. If you decide to do a PhD, it's similar in terms of your age. So again, you finish undergrad around the age of 22, typical PhD. So this would also be a doctorate. A typical PhD is about 4 to 5 years. And here you take coursework, but mostly what you do is research, and you write a thesis that basically is work that nobody else has ever done before. And then you have a committee that approves it, and then you get a doctorate. But even after that, you still have to do more training before you can get a job. It's at least another 2 to 4 years of training. So you're looking at roughly around the age of 32. And depending on what area you go into with a PhD, your starting salary when you get out, after your postdoc is over, this is called a postdoctoral fellowship. After these are over, your starting salaries might be anywhere from $60,000 to $130,000, depending on what the area is. The good thing about the PhD, though, is that this is all completely paid for. So you don't pay anything once you graduate college.
Craycraft,
It's all totally paid for.
please
by the
come to
graduate.
the CSP office.
Okay. Questions at all about
Miller,
PhD?
Craycraft, please come to
Yes,
the
you did both of these together.
CSP office.
So I actually did
O'Donnell
not.
Hall,
So
104.
I chose to just do an MD. I got into MD PhD programs and decided I couldn't commit to the full, it's about 8 years. I just couldn't bring myself to do it. So I went to Stanford for med school and I did just the MD. So that's an important point. You can be a scientist and have just one degree. You don't need both degrees. But you need one or the other in order to get a really good job. Like if you wanted to go to biotech or industry, you really have to have a PhD in order to get a pretty good job. You can get an entry-level job, but not really work your way up. There are other degrees you can get together with an MD or a PhD. You can get a JD, so you can do patent law. You can get an MBA. That's a very popular thing, to get an MD and an MBA to do medicine and business together. So let me try to sell you on being a physician scientist, which is what I do. So most of my time is actually spent, you'll see in a minute, most of my time is not spent doing research. So these are all the things that are great about it. So one of the first things you have to ask yourself if you're thinking about going into medical school is, do you want to take care of another human being? Because if you don't, and you do it just to get the degree, or you do the MD, PhD just to get the free tuition, you're going to be very, very unhappy. Taking care of somebody else is a lot of work, it takes a long time, and you really want to be committed to it. So if you're a physician scientist, there's lots of really cool things. So you get to make scientific discoveries, you do experiments that nobody else has ever done before. You have a lot of different options once you graduate as a physician scientist. So you can work in industry, academia. Typical starting salaries are usually over a couple $100,000. You have intellectual freedom, and the other thing too about being a physician scientist is you set your own schedule. So if you're the sort of person who doesn't mind coming to classes every day and doing this for 7 or 8 straight classes, you do the same thing every day, that's okay, but I couldn't do that. So I like having every day be completely different. I like not having a boss. So that's one of the great things about being a physician scientist. You're around super smart people all the time. You get to teach, you get to mentor younger people, and you get to take care of patients. So I'll show you an example in a minute how every single day for me is totally different. You're a continual student because you're still taking classes or teaching classes and being around smart people, and you get to travel a lot. So if you need to also think a little bit as your careers develop. What do you want out of life? Do you want to be rich? How many of you want to be rich? That's your goal. If my son was here, his hand would have been up. Both hands would have been up. So I personally didn't want to be rich, but I wanted to make enough money that I didn't have to really worry about money. I could travel when I wanted, I could play golf when I wanted, those sorts of things. So I love to travel, and I get to go to Europe and Asia every year, and somebody else pays for the trip. I usually get to take my family along. So when you're a physician scientist or a scientist in general, you get invited all over the place to give talks. It's really cool. You can consult, make money on the side for biotech companies. It's very flexible. And I have here, education is free. So if you do become a physician scientist, the education is free, but nothing is really free in life. If you get a full education and they pay for it, people have done studies showing that if you just went to medical school and then practiced, you'd actually make more money over the course of your whole life than you would if you didn't take the extra 3 or 4 years to do the second degree. Okay, so this shows you a couple things to also let you know a little bit about what you might be getting into. So the top one shows Monday through Friday and weekends what a typical week looks like for me. So every day is totally different. Typically on Mondays, I have clinic in the afternoons, although I stopped seeing patients about a year ago. Tuesday mornings, I have a biotech company, so I'm at the biotech company for the full Tuesday morning, helping them to get we're trying to get a product back into humans again. I spend time with immunology program and family. Wednesdays, I work from home, so I don't even go in most of the time, and then I'll do coaching or other stuff in the afternoon. Thursday is my MD PhD day, so I spend a lot of time with the MD PhD program there. And then Friday afternoon, I usually take off to play golf. And then weekends, kind of a hodgepodge of lots of different things. So the thing that I think is probably going to be most surprising to many of you is when you think about a scientist, you think about somebody who's sitting at a bench wearing a white coat, pipetting things, wearing goggles, right? So physician scientists or scientists don't do that. If you're in academia, you have people who do the work for you, and you basically go over their data and help mentor them and write papers and write grants. So all the skills you're learning in classes like this one, which is a literature class, learning how to read critically and how to write really well is really important, because that's mostly what my life is about now, is reading things critically and then writing. It's not about actually doing experiments. So you'll see here, bench research, 0 hours per week. A typical work week is about 60 hours. I spend 0 hours actually doing experiments. Okay, so for those of you who are thinking about medical school or graduate school, you want to think a little bit about what things you need to do in order to get into school. And one of the things I'll tell you is you should not make choices specifically because you want to look good for an application, whether it's for college or for med school or graduate school. So your college choice is important, but it turns out that most medical schools and graduate schools really like small liberal arts colleges. So you don't have to go to a Harvard, Yale, or a Stanford. You can go to small liberal arts schools. And if you do well at that school, it's just as good as going to a huge, top tier school. Major is also less important than you might imagine. The classic student who applies to medical school is a biology major or a pre-med major. And I can tell you that if you're an anthropology major, an engineering major, a computer science major, you look different than everybody else, and you're going to have a competitive advantage applying to medical school. Grades and classes are very important, like your SAT exams. There are specialized tests called the MCATs. to get into medical school. You have to do well on those. Letters are important, shadowing physicians is important, and I would say this part about shadowing, if you're not sure about medical school or maybe going into something in healthcare, you should try to find physicians who are still actively seeing patients and figure out a way to just hang out with them on an afternoon every couple months or over the summer and just see if you even like the profession, because it's better to learn now that you don't than to find out later. Research and leadership. So leadership is another important one. Many of you might be in lots of different clubs or things like that. So leadership, though, really means that you identify something in the community that's a problem, figure out a way to fix it, you pull together a bunch of students, and then you lead them, even if you're not successful. That's leadership. So for example, starting a club like this and organizing it, that's a good thing for your college transcript or your MCAT. Others include something called distance traveled, and distance traveled means if you come from a disadvantaged background, or you're the first in your family to go to college, that's a huge positive, and you should bring that out in your application. I won't talk about gap years for now. So there's a lot of other careers that are available besides just being a physician or a scientist. I list a whole bunch of them there. And many of these careers are great. So my wife is a pharmacist. She's works 3 days a week. A typical pharmacist now makes like $120,000 to $140,000 a year, so they make very good money, and it's essentially a 9-to-5 job. So if you want to spend a lot of time with your family, or you don't want to be on call all the time, pharmacy is a good profession. There's a whole bunch of others here. And then this is the last slide, and these are just tips for applying to college. How many of you are juniors?
Seniors?
Seniors. Some juniors, some seniors. So the seniors probably just turned into Common App, right? So a few things here. Be very proactive, meaning be aggressive, get your applications in early. I have that here. I actually used to have it down here a second time. Applying early is important. When it comes to medical school, it's actually really important because we start getting applications in June, and by August, we've already given out more than half of our interviews. So if you're not early, you're at a huge competitive disadvantage. And for colleges that have rolling admissions, you should try to be proactive and early. Have others review your application. Letter writers, you want to make sure you have people who are writing letters for you that you think will write a good letter, but also who know you well and can talk about things that maybe other people don't know about. Definitely personalize your essay, so don't just write what you think they want to hear. Write what you want to write about, something about yourself. Again, diversity, take advantage of diversity if you are underrepresented in science or medicine, or underrepresented minority, if you have a long distance traveled, you come from a disadvantaged background, so make sure you bring that out in your application. Colleges want diversity. They absolutely want diversity, and that includes, so if you're applying to East Coast schools or schools not in California, they love to have kids from California. Love California kids. Leadership and community service, we talked a little bit about. Again, leadership has to be substantive. If you're a scholar athlete, colleges and medical schools love that too. There's nothing for med school that we love more than seeing a student who is even a Division III athlete who was able to do other things. That shows commitment to one thing. Even if that's the only thing on your resume is being a scholar athlete, that's perfectly fine. Practice your interviews if interviews are relevant. If you've done research or you have an opportunity to do research, you should definitely do that. You should use contacts as well. So definitely keep in touch with schools that are some of your top choices. I would strongly encourage you to look at summer programs if you're interested in research, and I've listed just a few here, but SIMMER is one. If you just search SIMMER and Stanford, it'll be the first thing that comes up. There's another at Roswell Park in Buffalo, New York, City of Hope in Southern California. There are literally dozens of these all over the country. So I would encourage you to do those. And definitely listen to your government counselors. So we have a little bit of time left for questions. There's handouts here for those people who didn't get handouts. So feel free to pick them up. Yes?
So is a fellowship you're just staying at the hospital and then they're paying you to just get more experience? Or?
Yeah, it's a good question. So for residency, so for internship and residency, you're typically in the hospital roughly every fourth night, staying overnight in the hospital. When I trained, it was every third night, and we literally would come in at 6 in the morning and leave at 8 o'clock at night the next night without having slept. And we did that every third or fourth night for 2 or 3 years. Nowadays, there's work hour rules. For fellows, in most cases, the fellows take call from home. So if they're on call, they have to come in and see a patient, but they're actually sleeping in their own bed each night.
You were mentioning combining, medicine and engineering and those kinds of things. Like a good example of how to do that?
A good example. So there's a couple ways. One would be to go to a medical school that has very good research. So most of the top tier schools like here would be Stanford, UCSF, UCLA, Penn, Harvard, Yale. The really top tier schools have excellent research. That would be one. And you can do your MD and either get a master's in engineering or a PhD. The second is to actually apply right out of college for an MD PhD program called the Medical Scientist Training Program. And there are roughly right now about 5,000 or 6,000 MD PhD students in the United States, and there's an enormous shortage. I didn't show that, but the number is decreased. It's been cut in half in the last 10 to 15 years, so there's a huge shortage right now.
Why do you think that is? I'm just curious. I feel like there's a lot of students in here, in this room, but also on Bellarmine's campus that are interested in STEM. I know Bellarmine, most of the kids don't know, will be investing in a STEM building in the next couple of years because of how prevalent of an industry it's become. But why do you think the numbers are decreasing? Is it the debt scaring kids away, or? I don't know, I'm just curious.
It's
I don't know if there's
it's
a right
a
answer.
great question. I think students, I think part of it is that there's just faster opportunities to make money and get a good job by going right into industry.
Sure.
And here in the Bay Area in particular, for engineering, computer science, that just seems to be what a lot of students are doing. Another thing that we've observed is for these high school programs, they're roughly about 60 to 65% of the applicants are women.
Wow.
And participation is roughly about 60-40 women. And then when you get to be in medical school, it's still slightly women greater than men, which is a trend. And then once you get into residencies and then the later things, complete flip. It's mostly men and not so many women. So, but I think the thing about STEM that's really exciting is there's so many opportunities. And you don't know at this stage what you might want to do. You might get excited about teaching, and then you might want to be a high school teacher or a college teacher, or maybe you love writing and policy, you get involved in the government and science. There's all kinds of jobs like that. Or maybe you like working with your hands, and then you become an engineer or a scientist. So STEM just gives you so many opportunities. Let me add one other thing too that I probably should have put in here. If I was a freshman starting at Bellarmine, I would not leave this campus without having taken statistics and computer science. If you can't program by the time you get to college, you can make it up there, you can certainly learn there, but by the time you get to college, many of the students already know how to do some coding. And by the time you get through college, if you can't code, you're going to be very hard to hire in the workplace. So I would take advantage of whatever Bellarmine has to offer, and also think about summer programs where you might be able to do coding, community colleges, those sorts of things in the summers, but it's just super important in the workplace right now. Yeah.
Could you speak a little more about SIMMER?
So SIMMER is a program that I've been running now for 18 years. We had 89 students in the program last summer. We had 1,200 applications.
Wow.
So in the previous year it was 60-something students and 1,600 applications. It was harder to get into SIMMER than it was to get into Stanford undergraduate. Wow. So, and so students come and they work for 8 weeks. They work in a research lab. They get all kinds of safety training and things like that. They get paid, so you get anywhere from $500 up to $3,500 based on need, but everyone gets paid. At the end of the summer, there's a poster session, there's an abstract, a poster, and a brief presentation that you do with your group. And I think the students who participate, for the most part, about 90% of them report that they had a really, really good experience. The other 10% say that they never want to do research again, which is actually perfectly fine. We know that that's going to be the case. So I would definitely encourage you all to apply. So the other thing I should point out, you're not eligible until you have to be 16, and you're not eligible until after your junior year. So after junior year or after senior year. And if you're underrepresented or disadvantaged, you have a huge competitive advantage for the program, because some of the scholarship slots are specifically for students who are disadvantaged or underrepresented. Yeah.
When do the applications close for SIMMER?
That's a good question. The applications go online in the next week or two, and I think it's I should know this. I don't know. So even though I run the program, I have a full-time person who does most of the work now, and then there's, over the course of the summer, like 18 teaching assistants. So I'm much less involved until the summer actually starts, and I'm very involved. But it's several months from now. And the other thing to know is, though, you'll see that there's a thing about hard deadline. You can't pass the deadline. If you're a day or two late, as long as you let us know, we'll figure out a way to accept applications. Yeah.
Would you recommend, if we want to apply to SIMMER, would you recommend that we get the application in as early as possible, or does it not factor into?
For SIMMER, it doesn't, that's a very good question. It does not matter for SIMMER at all. We don't do rolling applications. So we won't even look at them until they're all done. We track the applications in real time, so the night before we can actually see who's still filling out an application and what their zip code is, and we have a map of the United States showing where everyone is who's doing it, so you can actually track the demographics of people. It's kind of like what happened on election night, where you can see who was voting where. Yeah.
If you're applying to SIMMER, would you suggest writing Ballman down as their school until like we met you or something like that?
So yeah, that's a good question too. So I think certainly, so I would definitely note that I came here and gave a talk to all of you, and then you heard me present and got very excited about it. I think that probably would be a positive thing. The applications are all done. I don't review them. They're all reviewed by graduate students and postdoctoral fellows. But if they see that, and they see that I actually did an outreach to a high school, and I do this for other high school directors, to mostly the schools in the very poor school districts. I do it here because my son goes here. But yeah, that would be helpful. That's a really good point. Anytime you interact with a college, somebody like who comes here to visit from a college, and you're interested in that college, you should say, I went and I met with so-and-so. When they see a name, then they can now sort of person with the name.
We have like 2 minutes.
Yep.
Just a brief question, what email can we reach you at, like, for questions?
Sure, so I can put it down here. Another thing to think about too is if you know people if you happen to know people at Stanford who run research labs and take students, so I only take students through SIMMER, but we often will have faculty members who will have some student, they agree to take a student, and then they come to us saying, well, can you help with getting this, I'll take the student into the lab, but can you help this student get all the safety training and everything done? And so that's another way to kind of work your way into a lab. Be aggressive when it comes to trying to get into a research lab. Faculty, you'd be surprised how often you email a faculty member at Stanford or UCSF or one of these schools, they'll actually answer you and oftentimes will engage you. So they're normal people for the most part. Not me. Other questions?
Big round of applause, guys.
There's handouts here, and if I can send a copy of the slide deck to the person who invited me, and then that can be circulated or whatever you want to do.
You might